Hi everyone, this is the second video lecture of our week 6, and the goal of this lecture is to focus on the commemorative monuments in the Akkadian Kingdom and what role they played in the shaping of imperial landscapes of this very short-lived territorial state, and how their unique ideology of kingship, ideology of the state, and sovereign power was actually shaped and given a particular specialty in its expression in these public monuments. So Akkadians actually existed as an ethno-linguistic group, existed in Mesopotamia from the very beginning as a separate group, but very much socially integrated. And although Sumerian was always the kind of official language, so it seems that they had not found good expression with their mythologies, with their stories, with the state administration, and so on. The founder king of the dynasty, Sargon, establishes a new city called Agade, and moves the capital of his administration to that city. And we think that Agade was located somewhere in the middle of Mesopotamia, near somewhere Kish, the city of Kish or Nippur. But the site is not archaeologically known. It has not been discovered, but we're aware of its existence, and it was a very monumental and important city from the textual archives of earlier Mesopotamian cities. With the establishment of Agade and the Akkadian Kingdom, the political and economic power in the urban landscape that shifted from the temple institution to the palace institution in a distinctive kind of way. We saw in the early dynastic states, if you recall from last week, like the Temple Oval and the Abu Temple, how those are kind of really powerful institutions in the temples in Uruk, for example. But with the Akkadian Kingdom, we see that power gradually transformed towards the palace. So this map illustrates the locations that are mentioned in Akkadian inscriptions, therefore really shows the territorial ambitions of these kingdom, reaching to various frontier landscapes. And the red dots are for Sargon, the orange are for Rimush, yellow are Manishtushu, and green are Naram Sin, the four significant kings of the Akkadian dynasty. And so you can see how they reached out all the way to, in northern Mesopotamia, all the way to the Mediterranean, in northwest Syria, the coast including Cyprus, and then into the Anatolian plateau, most likely seeking acquisition of resources such as cedar trees from northwest Syria, silver in Anatolia, and copper in the Persian Gulf. We see that they are also carrying out major expeditions in the Persian Gulf to Oman, to Dilmun, and so particularly for the copper sources, and also important stones like diorite. And so this evidence is accompanied with actual monuments themselves that are found in these frontier landscapes. And so, for example, this basalt fragment of a stele dated to the reign of Naram Sin, based on the inscription itself. Possibly this is a representation of Naram Sin himself in profile. And this was found at the site of Pir Hussein in southeastern Turkey. And this is one of the sort of really the remotest reaches of the Akkadian conquests into the East Anatolian highlands. This area is also pretty close to the copper mines in metal sources in that region in eastern Turkey near Erganimaden. If you look at the stele type monuments raised by the Akkadian kings, we see a fascinating development and continuity with the stele of Eanatum from Tello, from Girsu, from the city-states of Lagash. This fragment of a stele carved out of diorite, which is a boulder, sort of kind of a cylindrical boulder where the image is wrapping around this this boulder. Very hard and handsome stone diorite. It's acquired from Oman, and when you polish it, when you finish it, it's kind of really very beautiful stone. And it's currently in the Louvre Museum because it was excavated by French archaeologists in Susa. The idea that this monument must have been taken and carried away as booty in antiquity by Elamites, by Iranians, later in the 2nd millennium BC, and we'll talk about that later. Diorite was acquired from Oman, and it was associated with coupled with copper mining. So this is an interesting source where you're doing copper mining. There's also the availability of diorite because of the specific geology of that landscape. The stele, if you look at what is represented on the stele, we see that it has a standard register format with a series of, on the top register, we see a series of naked male prisoners of war being carried off with their wrists bound. Just pay attention to how their wrists are bound, and they're being walked away to the left and by the soldiers on the right. We identify the King Sargon in the lower corner, a procession of men, and we identify him because of an inscription that's in front of his head that identifies him as King Sargon. The nakedness of the soldiers that are depicted on top actually refer to their weakness. They're deprived of power. Contrary perhaps to what we saw in the Urukways, where we saw these kind of nude male supplicants bringing food, and they're kind of really dedicating themselves to the goddess. Whereas here we're actually seeing enemy soldiers being depicted in the nude. Similar to the stele of Eanatum, in line with the stele of Eanatum, where the soldiers of Umma were depicted also naked. We see a series of other fragmentary stele found in various parts of the empire in urban contexts. And these stele continue this formal aspect of the Sargon stele, these register-style representations, and you read them from bottom to top. So the first one I'd like to share with you is Rimush stele, which is found in Tello, in Girsu, in southern Mesopotamia, which also has an inscription that identifies the king, the sponsoring king, as Rimush, and son of Sargon, and the second king of dynasty. Carved in the softer limestone, the stele continues the register convention of the representation and depicts further military conflict and violence. We see again the depiction of the defeated enemies as naked. And we should note, if you look at the image of the naked enemy that is being who's in the second register, the middle register, where he's being sort of subjugated by pulling his beard, and he's kind of really, he has this gesture of giving up his life. And that, but if we look at his body, we see how actually this kind of representation of the body, instead of trunk-like figures of the early dynastic period, we see now a lot of interest in the depiction of the body, including the muscles, and so on, and so a greater interest in the representation of the human body is accurate. The second and third examples are from Susa, and one is the olivine gabbro fragment of a stele, most likely dated to Sargon. The second one, a translucent alabaster fragment of a stele. They're both fragments, but they share the topic of the naked prisoners of war being carried off. And so so very interestingly, they continue this sort of register style representation in different form. So there must have been a lot of these monuments that are set up within the Akkadian Kingdom in various parts of the empire. But perhaps the one fully preserved stele that I'd like to sort of really spend the rest of this lecture on is really the most monumental one, the stele of Naram Sin, which was also discovered, like the last two stele, it was also discovered in Susa. The stele of Naram Sin, and I like this picture because it just shows you the scale. It's a fairly large monument, and also this one you can see actually when it was discovered in 1898 at Susa, how it was being transported. It's a really several men are just really pulling the stele, and it's a really a giant sort of monument. The stele of Naram Sin is named after one of the last rulers of the Akkadian dynasty, who was very instrumental in characterizing his kingship and his image in a kind of a really innovative and famously innovative and ambitious way depicted in this particular stele. It's inscribed with a brief inscription that celebrates Naram Sin's victory over the Lulubi tribe on the Zagros Mountains. And so this is a victory stele that celebrates Naram Sin's military victory over this Lulubi tribe. And we will see why this location is actually very, very important. First of all, we see the representation of the mountain itself, and the stele itself in a way represented as a mountain, which is very, very important here. Based on the inscription, we understand that the monument was set up in the city of Sippar in southern Mesopotamia, and the overall design, the stele represents a radical break from the visual conventions of earlier Mesopotamian monuments. As you know, the early dynastic monuments that we looked at, and the earlier Akkadian monuments, they used this kind of register-style representation to present an episodic narrative. Whereas in this one, that it eliminates those, this representation actually eliminates those horizontal registers of representation. We see the representation of a mountain that the king and his army climbs in one complete scene, while the overall shape of the monument also mimics the shape of the mountain itself. The second remarkable innovation is the way the king himself is represented. While in earlier monuments, these kind of large human-shaped divinities, gods and goddesses actually took role. You'll remember the Natum stele with Ningirsu showing up. we see here actually the biggest individual here, the biggest body is the king himself, Naram Sin, that is actually dominating the scene. The Steely, I want to take a quick break from describing the scene before getting into more detail. There's another inscription, there's a secondary inscription on the Steely that I'm showing you here, where it describes how the Steely was actually carried off by Elamites in the 12th century BCE, about 1,000 years later than its carving, as a booty, as a war booty, when the Elamites from Iran came in and invaded Mesopotamian cities, probably also Sippar, where this monument was set up, and they carried away. That's why it was found in Suja in Iran. And so the inscription reinscribes and actually commemorates this new takeover. And the king says, I am Shutruk Nahunte, son of Halutush in Shushinak, beloved servant god of the god in Shushunak, king of Anshan and Suja, enlarger of my realm, protector of Elam, prince of Elam. At the command of the god in Shushunak, I struck down the city of Sippar, where this monument must have stood. I took the Steely of Naram Sin in my hand, I carried it off and brought it back to Elam. I set it up in dedication to my lord in Shushunak. So this is actually something that happens about 1,000 years later, 1,000 years after Naram Sin. Okay, so back to Naram Sin's monument. We see in the composition, towards the top of the composition, we see Naram Sin being depicted in this kind of semi-nude, muscular, bearded, and larger than all the human figures, and strikes a pose of victory, holding his bow and arrow, and with one step upwards towards the mountain. He wears a helmet with horns, which actually which is usually interpreted as an announcement of his divinity. So by wearing a helmet with horns, he's actually saying, I am God. And so this is a very controversial image, and we have a sense from historical records that this was not received very well. And so anyway, so in front of him are dying enemy soldiers and begging for their life. As we see below, as we see Naram Sin's soldiers are climbing up the mountain with ceremonial standards on the left and a clear upward gaze. They're looking up the mountain. We also see enemy soldiers that are falling down, upside down, down the mountain and brutally being killed. This is a scene where the battle is both progressing, the soldiers are moving upwards, but it's also over. It's also already over. They've already lost and they've been killed. And so the artists who carved the stele seem to have paid very close attention to the trees. So if you look at the representation of trees in the scene, we see that these are, in fact, very carefully represented, and scholars have identified particular species of trees being represented in a very accurate kind of way. What's really stunning is actually if we travel to this area of the Zagros Mountains where the Lulubi tribe would have been, we find rock monuments that are with very similar themes of victory, such as this rock relief at Derband Gaur in the Suleymaniya Governorate of Iraqi Kurdistan, dated to the late 3rd millennium BCE, and we see a particular king walking upwards, climbing, confident, and this kind of really gesture really is precisely the same as what Naram Sin has offered in his stele. He's stepping over the enemies. It's very, very striking. And here's the context for this rock monument. It's at an important mountain pass. You can see it's like a cave-like space where it is being carved. So I wanted to include this photograph just to show you the context of the rock relief, what kind of a landscape it is being carved in. And so what is fascinating is that when archaeologists actually surveyed this large region, they found out that in this region of the Zagros Mountains, the Arbandiga rock relief is in fact not a single example, but a rock relief that participates in a royal language of rock monuments. A stylistic and iconographic visual language, a visual vocabulary which does not always belong to the Akkadians themselves, the Mesopotamians, but also shared by the local rulers, by rulers of the Lulubi as well. So I'm showing you drawings of these rock monuments that are surveyed by archaeologists in this region. For example, the Sare Pol is Zohab relief on the lower left, or Shaikan relief on the lower right, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, overlooking the Diyala River, which actually connects Mesopotamian plain to the Iranian uplands. It's a very important landscape. So if you look at the relief of Anubanini, one of these examples from the Diyala River Valley, we see these kind of shows the ruler of King of Lulubi, who is being depicted actually in Naram Sin stele as being defeated and killed. He shows himself in very similar pose as Naram Sin, both victorious and stepping on an enemy, holding a bow and arrow, and in the likeness of Naram Sin's posture, we know from his stele. So he's accompanied with prisoners of war in the bottom, you can see. That's a motif that we see also in the other Akkadian monuments that we looked at earlier today. While he's also being invested with legitimate kingship by a goddess who is facing him, who represents him. He presents him with a ring, which is understood as the royal insignia of just kingship, of justice, just rulership. Right? So perhaps we want to understand this language of imaging kingship represents kingship as a matter of political contestation that emerged locally from this borderland region. And what Naram Sin is doing, he's borrowing this vocabulary from this landscape. It's either, so the Akkadians are probably not just unilaterally creating this visual vocabulary, but they're participating in a kind of a shared world of these representations. So the what we see in the Akkadian stele of Naram Sin as a public monument, first and foremost, the sexualized divine body of the ruler. And this is very important. This is something that actually we did not see before. Secondly, we see the registers as a convention of representation are abandoned, while we see that the entire scene is unified within a mountain landscape. And this is it really brings this really interesting effect of the real, and I'd like to see that the accuracy of the landscape with its trees, with the mountain, and so on, is very much part of the narrative. Third, the stele's iconography shares a visual language with rock reliefs in the Zagros Mountains carved into the living rock, and Naram Sin is not maybe creating this but participating and borrowing. And third, the idea that this stele is actually carried off to Iran by Elamites about 1,000 years later, and reinscribed by the Elamite kings. So if we compare, finally, and I'd like to sort of really wrap up my lecture here, if we compare the stele of Naram Sin with this kind of slightly earlier stele of Eannatum, or the stele of vultures, that Irene Winter discusses in her article, we can point out that major compositional and iconographic differences here. We see how the abstract horizontal space of the registers, right? There's this kind of an abstraction to the horizontal registers in the stele of Eannatum. We don't know where we are exactly. Whereas in the stele of Naram Sin, we are carefully located in a landscape, in this very particular landscape of the Zagros mountain. And so we can also compare the ceremonial garb and the kind of really traditional trunk-like representation of Eannatum as a king with his kind of ceremonial dress, whereas we can contrast that with Naram Sin, who is semi-nude. He's almost wearing nothing. But this kind of really horned helmet, which announces him as God. And so in the stele of Eannatum, we also, if you recall, in the reverse, on the other side of the stele, we had the god Ningirsu, who is represented as a human in his human shape, whereas here that kind of divinity is really located only within Naram Sin's body, although we do have a number of kind of really these figurative representations of various gods on the very sky close to the top of the stele, like Shamash and moon god Nana and so on. And so this is really quite fascinating. And so I'm hoping that we will continue to point out the differences and similarities between these two monuments in the stele, and would like to sort of really conclude my lecture here. In the third and final lecture, we will turn to the art of the Akkadian Kingdom outside of the public monuments. So thank you for listening.